Good evening or good afternoon to our audience joining in from all over the world. And welcome to the final day of the Gulf International Forum's 4th Annual Conference. It's such a pleasure to be here alongside an esteemed lineup of speakers discussing perhaps one of the most important topics, one of the hot topics nowadays, but one of the topics that I usually like to think of as the elephant in the room, or one of several elephants in the room in the compartments of the GCC nowadays. And this one in particular is the youth question. Others include the questions, of course, of women and of migrant workers. So the COVID pandemic has certainly shifted this stationary elephant in the room in quite myriad and rather uncomfortable ways. And now, more than ever, the question of addressing the so-called youth bulge has become inevitably pressing and demanding. During the youth uprising resulting from the Arab Spring in 2011, GCC countries tried to reconcile with the youth question, albeit through the creation and generation of governmental jobs to fill in the unemployment gap and provide a sense of security. That is a reconciliation rooted in the rentier model, as we all know, that still structurally governs how GCC countries operate. During the same period, we began witnessing socioeconomic and sociopolitical paradigm shifts that came in the form of ambitious vision statements and developmental plans across the GCC. And at the heart of these plans lay a big promise for the youth community as a way for governments to show that the youth are important and their matters are taken into consideration and that they are working towards a better future for them. But these visions and promises were challenged with the pandemic, following tight austerity measures, closures of schools, and the inability to bridge the gap between the job market and the education sector, and also an age-long asymmetry between the educational outputs and job market requirements. This was combined with lack of social empowerment, restrictive political freedom, and loss of confidence from the youth towards their governments. During the isolation period resulting from lockdown and curfews, the youth communities in the GCC opted for social media outlets to come together and share their discontent, their attitudes towards what was happening around them. And we witnessed heated debates, distress, a recurring theme of wanting to migrate for fear of lack of grounded future opportunities, and a general climate of disappointment. Such matters, if left unaddressed by countries, may be quite detrimental, and no vision or colorful infographics with promising slogans can resolve this issue. Today, and on the final day of the 4th annual conference, it has been dedicated to the question of youth. Now, personally, prefer using the signifier question as opposed to the signifier problem, because thinking of youth as a problem or the problem of youth or the issues facing youth, or even concepts like the youth bulge in themselves result in a form of disavowal that makes it difficult to formulate actual real solutions, as opposed to the tried and worn out prosthetic solutions, the ones that we saw during the Arab Spring. And this panel aims to address such questions. Questions such as, how can the GCC increase youth participation and engagement? What are the youth perceptions about economic and reform plans? How aware are the youth and how involved are they in these economic and reform plans? What is the role of education in the preparation of youth for more proactive roles in the economy and also in society? How is the youth community impacting and affecting changes in the social contract? And will these impact, the result, or will this impact result in economic opportunities for future generations? To help unpack and address these questions, I am joined today by the GCC's finest thinkers and scholars, and it's such an honor to moderate this panel and think and speak alongside Dr. Hanaa Almoaibed, Research Fellow at King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies in Riyadh, Dr. Mark Thompson, Senior Associate Fellow at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Riyadh, and soon to be Dr. Ibrahim Alhouthi from UCL Institute of Education. We had a fourth speaker who unfortunately couldn't join us today, So I'm going to begin with our first speaker, Dr. Hanaa Almoaibed, Research Fellow at the King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies, Associate Fellow at Chapman House, and Visiting Fellow at London School of Economics, LSE. Dr. Hanaa Almoaibed researches the influence of social dynamics on youth attitudes towards work, education, and careers in the GCC, with emphasis on vocational education in Saudi Arabia. Dr. Hanaa has managed several curriculum research and development initiatives with Saudi schools, expanding social science, entrepreneurship, and careers education opportunities in collaborations with such entities as the British Council, the UNESCO, American University of Beirut, Saudi Chamber of Commerce, and multiple think tanks. Dr. Hanaa, how have social dynamics and attitudes towards work, education, and career choices affected youth transitions in the GCC in general and Saudi in particular? Dr. Hanaa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to the Gulf International Forum for hosting us and for having a panel on this very important topic. I am very happy to be here alongside two of my colleagues who look at young people and youth within the GCC. I will focus primarily on Saudi today, but obviously some of these trends are common to the other GCC states. So when I look at youth transitions, or the question of youth transitions in Saudi Arabia, I think that one undeniable truth is that things are very different today than they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So the experience of being young within Saudi Arabia is a very, very different one to the one, for instance, that I grew up in or grew up with. And so I think that, just to start off, it's very important to acknowledge that even if change looks different in Saudi Arabia than it does in other contexts, or within the GCC than it does in other contexts, there is significant change. There are a lot of young people in Saudi Arabia. Out of the 20 million Saudis, 58% are under age 30. However, the vision does think about young people, Vision 2030 does think about young people as an opportunity. So just to quote from the vision, we'll take advantage of this demographic dividend by harnessing our youth's energy and by expanding entrepreneurship and enterprise opportunities. So there is a very big kind of emphasis on the role of young people in moving the project, the Saudi Vision 2030 forward. Within Saudi Arabia's, the Vision 2030 of Saudi Arabia, there is increasing employment opportunities in the private sector for young people. There's increasing Saudi employment in non-traditional roles for Saudis. So there's an expansion of young people working in entertainment, in tourism, in retail, and even in construction. There's a lot of support for entrepreneurial ventures and SME growth. And there's a blending of gender roles. So whereas spaces in the past may have been very much segregated, there's more space for young people, both male and female, to work together, but also people working in non-traditional roles. So kind of that traditional female or traditional male role has also kind of, those edges are blurring a little bit. And there are a lot of legal changes and kind of new arrangements that have loosened some of those social and religious constraints that used to really kind of dictate the way kind of social spaces and workspaces used to work. So, aside from just women driving, there's also kind of a relaxing of mixing within the workplace. There's many more opportunities for entertainment, tourism, etc. However, on the flip side of that, there are declining government employment opportunities, which is a problem for young people. And I will talk about that a little bit more. There's that push toward kind of diversification away from the oil economy has put a lot of pressure on young people to find work outside of traditional kind of government roles, because those government employment opportunities are declining. There's an increasing price of not only gas, but also other utilities, goods and services, electricity and water. There's also the introduction of VAT for the first time. Now it's at 15%. So this was something that young people and just citizens in the past didn't have to deal with. And among unemployed Saudis, which is around 11-12%, 62.9% of them are between ages 20 and 29 years old. So there's a very high youth unemployment rate. When I research young people's transitions and kind of why there's such a large unemployment rate for young people, or maybe what some of those challenges are when transitioning, I think about the social dynamics. So I look at gender, socioeconomic status, and relationships. And when I think of relationships, I think of family. And I also think of different social connections and the idea of kind of who you have access to in terms of support. But also how attitudes toward work have evolved over time. So, this is something I recently wrote about with Dr. Mark Thompson, actually. We looked at kind of the way the attitudes toward work have evolved. So there was definitely much more of a kind of risk-taking culture in the past, because there weren't a lot of work opportunities. So this is kind of pre-modern to 1950s. Informal work opportunities were the common kind of opportunities that young people pursued. And then, that evolved into having kind of those initial entrepreneurs, very commercially minded Saudis, kind of attracting FDI, but also going abroad and finding new opportunities. And so at that point, from there, you had this more proliferation of formal work opportunities in both the private and public sector. And then there became kind of, be seen in the 70s and 80s, a very common role would be to work within government. And that mentality has stuck with most people within the country. So that's kind of where we are. And a lot of that has to do with that generational relationship. So, parents are the ones who are thinking about offering a lot of career guidance. And there is this idea that, a role within a government job is the safest and probably the best, although those are declining. So now we've moved toward a more informal kind of labor market again. So decreasing opportunities for government sector employment means more entrepreneurship. And there is support on multiple fronts for that. But there is less of a spirit of risk-taking than there was in the past because of that kind of, again, if we're talking about the social contract, because of that idea that you would find employment within the government sector, and that would be kind of the safe opportunity or the safe option. In looking at kind of how young people transition into education, just some numbers. So 55% of secondary graduates successfully enroll in bachelor's degrees. Some 20 to 30% also enroll in TVET. So most people today are pursuing post-secondary education in comparison to kind of, the 1950s and 60s, when very few Saudis were actually enrolled in any formal education. And I think it was 95% of the population above age 15 were illiterate. So there's been a huge shift in terms of opportunities within the education sector. In 2017, 66.75% of all students enrolled in university, however, were enrolled in humanities, social science, or business administration. And unfortunately, 25% of unemployed Saudis held one of these specializations. So even if there's an increasing kind of opportunity to pursue post-secondary education, so much of that is prepping you for those kind of more comfortable jobs in government, predominantly in administration. And there is still quite a bit of a gender divide, even if those lines are blurring. So 98.5% of engineering and related field graduates are male, and 72% of all humanity graduates are female. You also then have a divide in terms of what you can pursue with secondary vocational education that's predominantly only offered to young men. And you have 92 public vocational college campuses and 23 for males and 23 for women. And then also, 2/3 of Saudi women are university graduates. But then that's not reflected in the labor market. See, I'm already running out of time. So I will just kind of wrap up, and hopefully we can revisit some of this in the Q&A. But I just wanted to say that, you know, in terms of choice and that opportunities in kind of employment specifically, there is that social safety net that still is there. So that risk taking has not necessarily accelerated. You still have kind of a waiting to see if you're going to get a government job. And you do rely very heavily on connections and family networks in order to find those. So, you know, as much as there are opportunities and things are changing, there still are several cultural and social aspects that are keeping young people in that mindset where they're looking for more comfortable positions. So opportunities are increasing, but there still is a lot of work that needs to be done in order to kind of really get people motivated to go into maybe riskier or less traditional pathways into both education as well as employment.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hanaa. That was most illuminating, and you raised a lot of points that it's a recurring theme that's been echoed over and over again. And one of the important things that you mentioned, it kind of like resonated well with me, and I know it definitely resonates with our next speaker, is like is the you know, the majors, the college majors that actually prepare students for administrative jobs. So it's already, you know, preset for them. And this reminds me of like the nationalization programs that are, you know, Kuwaitization, Saudiization, and these initiatives actually even predate the Arab Spring as a form of like initiative for people to migrate to the private sector. But these programs, unfortunately, you know, while their aim was to like shift the burden from the public sector employing nationals, nevertheless have resulted also in mass unemployment in the government sector. And so we begin to wonder why such initiatives and programs have, you know, have had little effect, or some of them have failed. And to answer this question, I now turn to our second speaker, Dr. Ibrahim Alhouthi. Ibrahim Alhouthi is a researcher in the comparative politics of education. He is currently doing his PhD, and hopefully he's almost done, at UCL Institute of Education in London, focusing on the politics of education reforms in the Arab Gulf states. He holds 2 master's degrees from UCL Institute of Education, an MA in leadership and an MA in comparative education. He published several articles about the question, the education system in Kuwait and MENA region, and worked on several academic projects. Dr. Ibrahim, how has the education been altered in the GCC states in light of the push to nationalize the workforce and diversify economic revenues?
I would like first to thank the Gulf International Forum for the invitation and organizing this virtual conference. As you asked, my talk will focus on how education has been reformed in the Gulf state in the light to push to nationalize the workforce and diversifying the economic revenues. First of all, it's important that the idea of diversifying economic revenues is not new to the region. There were several attempts and plans in the 70s and the 80s to decrease the over-reliance on oil. However, nothing has been changed. The oil revenues are still constituted around 90% of the national revenues in the region. While we entered the 21st century, the diversification of the economy in the region became urgent and necessary. The instability of the oil prices marks the biggest risk to the national revenues in the region. The second main challenge, which is most focused on our panel today, is that these days, and making the diversification of the economy urgent, is the increasing number of young educated citizens in the Gulf region reaching employment age, which increased the demand for the job. Historically, when these states started to use their oil revenues to build the modern state and its bureaucratic system back in the 40s and 50s, most of their labor force was illiterate. The Gulf region has long had small population, as we know, thus the national labor force was limited. So foreign labor was needed to fill the gap and support national growth and economic development. However, the situation remained unchanged until now. And if we look at the figures in 2010, foreign laborers made up nearly 80% of the Gulf workforce, with 90% of them working in the private sectors, which create a population imbalance between citizens and foreigners. However, the number of young educated citizens who hold higher education certificate has increased sharply. In the past 2 decades, the Gulf government managed to create jobs in the civil service and public sector, with job creation becoming an objective in its own right, regardless of what these recruiters actually end up doing. Hence, the public sector and the civil service reach its full capacity, and in some states, such as Kuwait, the overemployment in the civil service is more than 50%. So the challenge now is how we can have or create a job for these young educated citizens. The only solution is to push these young educated citizens to work in the private sector. However, the majority are not willing to take the kind of jobs that foreigners accept, especially jobs in the private sectors. Many citizens turn down private sector position, preferring to remain unemployed in the hope of finding public sectors. Consultant firm who is working in the Gulf, in the region, argued that the education system is the reason for this result, as these youth were not prepared well and not qualified to join the private sectors. However, from my point of view, as well as many researchers mentioned that, this is not the real reason. Gulf youth prefer to work in the public sector as it's offer higher wages, shorter working hours, earlier retirement, and other benefits that make up a more attractive package than that provided by the private sectors. For example, the salary received by the Gulf citizens is not based on the amount of effort they put into their job or the benefit that the institution gained from their work. Instead, it is simply a way of distributing the state wealth to its citizens. This creates what Ayubi in 2009 called it rentier mentality, resulting in unproductive and non-competitive labor force that the state cannot always be relied upon. To face these issues, all Gulf countries, as we know, have launched the National Economic Vision, aiming to shift their economy to the so-called knowledge-based economy, making education reform at the heart of these visions. And for the first time, we witnessed the involvement of high-ranking ruling family in the education reform process, such as the Crown Prince in both Bahrain and Qatar were involved directly in reforming the education system, which illustrate how important reforming the education system is in this transformation era. Therefore, improving the quality of national education system is crucial for the economic diversification in the Gulf region. Traditionally, Gulf governments have viewed diversification of the economy as a purely economic matter, but they have recently managed to link economic and labor market issue with that education. As a result, Gulf leaders recognized, maybe for the first time, that education system had to be reformed if they were to develop the human capital that would make it possible to create knowledge-based economy. And this was the main motivation for reforming the education system. Several global business and management consultant firms, such as McKinsey, Rand, the World Bank, name it, who were involved directly in setting the education reform agenda to serve the economic needs. However, the education reforms agenda were framed based on their understanding and their expertise. They identified and present the problems of the education system from an economic perspective, presenting the problem that they could solve and ignoring the problems that should be solved in the first place. The question is, after two decades from launching education reform, have these reforms achieved its goal and in nationalizing the workforce and diversifying economic revenues? The answer is the article published last month in the Economist answered part of this question. The figure of citizens employed in the public sector remains similar to that in 2010. In Kuwait, for example, in the past 5 years, number have been moved in the wrong direction. The number of private sector job decreased by 3% from 2015 to 2020, where the civil service swelled by 22% to reach 338,000 employees. This indicates that these education reforms were unsuccessful and have not worked well in nationalizing the workforce, and diversifying economic revenues. I am afraid that the time will not be enough to explain the reason behind this failure. However, in short, reforming the education system and keeping the civil service and labor market untouched would not help in nationalizing the workforce and diversifying the economic revenues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. That was, you raised a lot of important things, the things that we've personally discussed together. And unfortunately, the education system has been caught in this rut of teaching for testing. And this kind of raises the youth into this mentality of, okay, I'm going to go into a job and, you know, it's a secure job in the government. So I know I don't need to really use my mind or kind of use critical thinking and reflect upon what's happening and how all these changes can impact me. So these are very, very important points. And we definitely need to reform education, and not just economically, but also socially and broaden our way of thinking. We have heard earlier from Dr. Hanaa, that the changes in Saudi Arabia have certainly transformed and repositioned Saudi. And we know from media that Saudi is on track with its Vision 2030, despite a lot of cultural obstacles. The youth themselves, though, might be the catalyst for overcoming such cultural obstacles, especially in light of the rapid economic changes that going forward might pose a lot of challenges that they cannot avoid anymore. So now I turn to our third and final speaker, Dr. Mark Thompson. Dr. Mark Thompson is a senior research fellow and the head of socioeconomic unit at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies. Dr. Mark was previously assistant professor of Middle East Studies at King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. Dr. Mark has lived and worked in Saudi since 2001 for diverse institutions such as the Saudi Arabian Airlines, the Saudi Arabian National Guard, and Prince Sultan University. Dr. Mark holds a PhD from the Institute of Arab Islamic Studies from the University of Exeter in the UK, and his principal research areas are Saudi socioeconomic development and societal transformation. And he has published on a number of topics on the Saudi youth and issues and challenges, including those facing women leaders in prestigious publications and journals. Dr. Mark, what role will Saudi youth play in the kingdom's attempts at reform, and how have these reforms affected youth? Dr. Mark, the floor is yours.
Salam alaikum. Good afternoon and indeed good evening to everyone here in Riyadh. Thank you very much, Shaikha, for the introduction, and also thank you to the Gulf International Forum for inviting me to participate in this timely event. I couldn't agree more with what my colleague Dr. Hanaa said and what you said yourself, Shaikha, at the beginning of this event, that youth, it mustn't be seen as a problem. They should be seen as an opportunity. And there's no doubt from the many years that I've spent in Saudi Arabia at multiple institutions that the potential I see amongst young Saudis is absolutely extraordinary. So yes, you've asked me to speak about sort of how these reforms have affected Saudi youth. So I'm going to sort of take a slightly different angle to my colleague, Dr. Hanaa, so we don't overlap. This is obviously a huge topic, so I can only touch on the relevant issues due to the time constraint, but hopefully we can elaborate in the questions later. And additionally, anybody, please feel free to contact me at any time. My contact details are on the King Faisal Center website. Now, coincidentally, and it is a complete coincidence, how Saudi economic reform and social reform has already affected Saudi youth is the subject of a new journal paper that I've researched and written that is actually due to be published in the next few weeks, entitled The Impact of Vision 2030 on Saudi Youth Mindsets. And in truth, what is frequently absent from the debate surrounding the vision is its immense psychological impact on young Saudis, which is especially significant as youth and children represent more than 2/3 of the Saudi population. So the focus of this paper and this research is on what the vision represents for the young Saudis I interviewed and surveyed, what they believe it is already achieved, and what they hope it will realize in the future in both personal and national terms. And I point out that when discussing the vision and its impact on Saudi Arabia's predominantly young population, it's very important to make a clear distinction between the vision itself and the more specific goals of the National Transformation Programme. Because on the one hand, the vision is precisely that. It's a vision of a future Saudi Arabia unshackled from many of the more restrictive practices of the past. So for many, the vision, in many of the people I talk to, the vision represents a concept of a freer kingdom, something that's intangible, where opportunities hopefully will abound for young nationals in the future. Whereas on the other hand, the National Transformation Programme exemplifies the sort of the nuts and the bolts, as it were, of the vision's tangible goals and programs. And it's within the National Transformation Programme that we can measure the progress or the success of specific vision projects. Now, living in the kingdom today, it is very clear that many young nationals are looking ahead to 2030 and beyond, because there's a sense here in Saudi Arabia that the country is living decidedly in the immediate present and future. And whilst there are issues and challenges, which of course Dr. Hanaa mentioned, there is also a sense of confidence and optimism. And what is clear from the research that I conducted with Saudi youth is that the vision has also sort of fostered a sense of possibility. So in other words, the vision has created what I comprehend as something as sort of like a national sentiment. That is a national sense of possibility amongst many young Saudis. And this is often linked to a desire for personal development, because many young people I speak to want to be able to make impactful contributions on an individual level to national development in line with the vision's goals. Now, I recall that when the vision was launched in April 2016, a student of mine at King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals, he maintained even then that Vision 2030 actually did have a clear and significant goal. And that was to shift the attitude of youth to become more future-oriented, to set goals and try and achieve these goals. So in other words, to become more ambitious. And to a greater extent, we have actually seen this happen. And this desire for personal growth, frequently achieved through acquiring new skills and qualifications, is today exemplified by educated young Saudis' use of LinkedIn. This application has become extremely popular across the kingdom in recent years, and individual certificates of achievement for a wide variety of courses are posted daily on LinkedIn, along with CVs, letters of recommendation, reflecting this desire for personal development and indeed fulfillment. However, of course, whilst it's true that the vision has created new jobs and opportunities in certain sectors, the competition for these positions and opportunities has increased significantly. So in consequence, self-development and enhanced technical and soft skills are becoming more important in the contemporary environment. What we've also witnessed in recent years is that excitement, if you like, about being part of the vision has led to greater interest in job positions responsible for or linked to vision-related projects amongst young Saudis. So, for example, one of my interviewees, he's around 25, said that he thought he would reach the age of 50 before he could lead and influence people. But nowadays, because of the vision, he sees people who are only 10 years older than himself leading the transformation and representing Saudi Arabia at both national and international forums. Hence, today's young Saudi leaders are the ones he aspires to emulate, because to him, they prove that what he was hoping to achieve by the age of 50 can actually become possible by the age of 30. And this has also been a determining factor in many Saudi overseas students returning to the kingdom, precisely because they're concerned that they're going to miss out on vision-related opportunities, or in social media speak, FOMO. There's this anxiety of missing out. And this phenomenon has been underscored by sort of the increase in employment opportunities in certain sectors that are linked to the vision, including entertainment, culture, and tourism. There is a sentiment amongst a lot of people that, basically the kingdom is heading in the right direction, and that actually it will be a better place for young Saudis and for future generations. But there's also awareness that these vital transformations require time, and that the results are not necessarily going to appear overnight. So this is linked to the idea amongst many people that actually what Saudi Arabia requires is a continuous, ambitious vision, precisely because national transformation and development is an ongoing process. And in truth, the impact of the vision on the kingdom and its future cannot be underestimated, according to most of the interviewees and respondents I talked to. Because the bottom line, as Dr. Hanaa mentioned earlier on, is that life has changed beyond recognition for many young Saudis, especially the well-educated and those living in the principal urban areas. So in conclusion, according to many of the young Saudis that I engage with, that I interview, that I survey, they also feel that they have a responsibility to maintain the progress already made under the vision to ensure a better life for the future generations that follow them. They don't wish those future generations to experience some of their pre-Vision 2030 difficulties, in much the same way that their parents and grandparents did not desire them to face the pre-oil boom hardships that they were accustomed to. And even those who believe that the future is not as clear-cut or as positive as it is often suggested, and who are skeptical that all the stated Vision 2030 goals will be achieved, a lot of the time they concede that actually the kingdom and young people are learning from this process. And this experience, if sometimes by trial and error, is actually beneficial. As a prominent Saudi social commentator said to me a couple of weeks ago, 2030 should be seen simply as a target. What is significant is that the concept of the vision becomes deep-rooted, is ongoing, and will last long after 2030 as Saudi Arabia continues its transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mark. That was a very positive way of looking at the visions, because a lot of people kind of lost this hope and visions, but to see the Saudi youth engage in the vision, and maybe an inspiration for other GCC countries to learn from as a case study. I will now take some questions from the audience, and the way that I'm going to take the questions, I'm going to read out the question and then at least have an opportunity for all our speakers to join in, to contribute at least 2 to 3 minutes per question, if that sounds good. So the first question from the audience is, what sort of incentives can the Gulf governments offer to entice the youth to work in the private sector rather than the public sector? And I will start with Dr. Hanaa.
Thank you. That's a really important question, especially because if you ask kind of employers at the moment, I think one of the statistics that I often cite, and hopefully it's changed, it might be outdated, is that 60% of CEOs don't believe that the education systems are equipping students with the right skills for employment. So I think there's already been a lot done in terms of trying to incentivize young people to go into the private sector. I mean, I do think one of the issues is that Saudization in itself and all of these nationalization approaches almost create another kind of layer of dependency on somebody else doing it for you. So I would say pulling back and letting the market do more of the work would be a really good idea. And understanding that, you know, you need to focus on your own excellence. So providing opportunities that actually equip young people to go into a competitive labor market is essential. And I think that more awareness about what a competitive labor market looks like, more focus on skills that CEOs do want in their companies is important. Right now, that's not necessarily happening. And I don't believe in that, you know, kind of human capital approach of we need to invest in people in order for you know, them to grow our economies. I think that education can do many things and create kind of well-rounded people who then will go off and do their own thing. So we don't need to invest in engineering to get more engineers. We need to create a more awareness of what it means to kind of be a good employee or a good entrepreneur and a good manager of your own kind of business, if that's what you want to do. But more literacy in that kind of area of labor markets, of employment. You know, many of the young people that I've worked with have no skills that are very much essential, like communication skills, collaborative skills, presentation skills, and they learn those on the job, yes, but it takes a lot of effort to get them involved in that. So I would definitely say starting earlier and a lot of career guidance, professional and systematic and really excellent career guidance that's linked to real information and opportunities is important in order to do that. So a lot of our reforms are not doing that, and I think we need to really work on getting people ready to work in general.
This kind of reminds me of the Public Authority for Manpower, previously known as the Manpower Restructuring Program in Kuwait, and they offered the whole Kuwaitization program. So there was like the subsidies, the incentives that they provided, but they also provided training programs for job seekers. And a lot of the job seekers would not continue the programs. They would say either they would drop out midway or would just take the certificate and then that's it, you know. So this remains a challenge also, this kind of this desire that Dr. Thompson, you know, earlier spoke about, you know, it still needs to be fueled. So what do you think of this? What do you think about it, Ibrahim, in the context of, let's say, Kuwait and MGRP, for example, and the initiatives that they tried to do?
Yeah, I think first of all in Kuwait, let me talk about Kuwait, for example. As I'm from Kuwait, we every time we talk about we need youth to go for private sector instead of public sectors. We heard a lot and we read a lot about labor market. But the question is, do we really have a labor market in order to push our youth and citizens for it? As a youth, for example, if I have two choices, either to go to the private sector or to go to the public sector, with all subsidies and advantage that provided by the public sector, I wouldn't ever think about to go to the private sector. So I think there's a real work need to be done in reforming the labor market, first of all, and reforming the civil service and public sector, in order to encourage youth and graduated students to join the private sector. And more than that, we need to have a structure. We need to have competencies, not only for the private sector, also for the public sectors. So we heard a lot about that the education outcomes does not fit with the labor market need. So the question is, what the labor market need? What is the competencies as educators? As a researcher working on the education reforms in the Gulf and in Kuwait. So if the government came to us and told us, we need you to prepare the youth and the young generation for the labor market, the question is, what do you need? So still this answer is not completed to the government, as well as I think most of the Gulf region. So the issue is not, from my point of view, yes, the education reform and the education system is not preparing the youth well, but however, this is not only the question, and this is not only the problem, because if I will continue as the way that every student, every graduate get out from the university is guaranteed with the job, with the guarantee with the salary. So as a youth, why do I need to work very hard? These mentality need to be changed in order to push the student and push the young generation to work hard and to think for their future.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. Yes, we have all of these programs, but most of them don't touch on shifting perceptions and changing, the mentalities. Dr. Mark, how would you approach this question with respect to what you said about the desire for skills that's kind of rising nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of research on this in the past, and very often when you talk to a lot of young people about what they're looking from a job, I mean, one of the things you still hear the most is job security, and no matter where you go in the kingdom, no matter in Saudi Arabia, I'm obviously talking about, no matter where you go in the kingdom, you keep hearing this, job security, and therefore that sort of stops a lot of young people, particularly young men, from maybe sort of considering going into the private sector. But I completely agree with what Dr. Hanaa was just saying. And I think one of, she talked about, empowering people and, career guidance and things like this. And this is incredibly important, because there's no point talking about we want, more young people to go into the private sector and go into different sectors and things like this, if these young people have absolutely no awareness of what these sectors are, what the positions that are available there are, what the type of job they might be expected to do, because they simply don't, because they get so little career advice, they get so little exposure to other types of jobs, and really those sort of traditional sort of streams where they're heading, like if you're a man, you're heading into medicine or engineering, still dominate so much. So, establishing proper career guidance, actually explaining to young people about what type of opportunities are available, and very importantly, those opportunities that might not be available today, but which are going to be available in 10 years' time. Because I'm not just talking to students who are seniors at university and are just about to graduate. That's far too late. This type of thing has to happen much, much earlier, in schools. Because unless you equip young people, unless you give them the knowledge, then how can you possibly then ask them to make choices when they simply don't know anything about it?
Absolutely. Very, very important points. Yes, I agree. We have a second question. We have a lot of questions. I'm very impressed that the audience is engaged with us. We have a question. Most, if not all, reforms in the Gulf states are purely economic. Do you think they can succeed without any political reforms? Can it be taxation without representation? Now, we'll, of course, again, begin with Dr. Hanaa.
Well, I mean, I think that that's a very narrow question, and I don't think that it's all purely economic. I mean, again, just going back to what Dr. Mark said, what I've been saying, it is a very different place today than it was in the past. And yes, perhaps you don't necessarily see these mass elections and people getting voted into office, but actually it is not one person making all decisions. There are other ways of kind of consulting with society that are definitely there. I mean, I'm actually currently working on a project that involves stakeholder engagement in the local, at the local level, and how the government is building many, many models to make sure that there are lots of ways to get feedback. So it might not look like a traditional democracy would look in your, definitions of what a Western democracy looks like, for instance, but there are ways where this consultation, this constant feedback is incorporated into decisions. And I think that that's something that we definitely need to use a different lens when kind of investigating what participation looks like in different contexts, instead of continuously trying to shoehorn the Gulf states into a different model. Now, are there decisions that are made from the top? Absolutely, yes. Most likely, many of them are. However, I do believe a lot of them are in the best interest of kind of social and economic development, as well as political development. I mean, you wouldn't have a stable kind of trajectory for economic and social growth if there wasn't a stable political context and atmosphere as well. So I would say there is a lot that's happening that might not be exactly how people expect it to look from the outside, and that you might, if you just scratch the surface and kind of look at what's happening and the types of engagement processes that are there, you'd be surprised. And then you could go even back further and think about municipal elections. You can think about chambers of commerce. You can look at the consultative council, but then you can look at a lot of the engagement that happens at the strategic level. So all of the focus groups and all of the different types of research that is done to collect the sentiments, the concerns, the fears, as well as the traditional way of collecting feedback from citizens, which is open forums with, officials that are in decision-making positions, specifically with the king and with the crown prince. Having that audience, having that ability to get to decision makers is something that has traditionally happened within the context quite a bit. So again, I don't think it's purely economic. I think a lot has changed socially. I also think you can look at laws that have changed. Again, people aren't necessarily always looking at these. You can look at all of the laws that are related to the labor market, but also anti-harassment laws. You can look at just kind of the women's file, if you want to call it that, and all of the opportunities that have changed for women in the workplace, for instance. All of those happen, with new laws, with new decrees, which obviously is not the word I want to use, but there are political changes that are happening internally as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Ibrahim, how would you approach this question in light of through your perspective of your own thesis, because it focuses on politics and education?
Yeah, I think this is a good question because from my point of view, I think that the most reform is focused in Kuwait, for example, most focused on economic reform. However, shifting the economic from an oil-based economy to knowledge-based economy, if we agree with this concept that it's fit with the Gulf, because still this is an under questioned approach in the Gulf. It doesn't need to be only from the economic and the labor market. You need a social movement, you need a social reform, and as well as you need a political reform. For example, in Kuwait, we are into a lot of political crisis since maybe 2010, 2011, and the country is not stable. Even the economic vision that was written in 2009, and however haven't been launched only in 2017, and still, if you go down on the street in Kuwait and ask youth or ask academic or scholars about education economic reform in Kuwait, none of them may know exactly what is this type of reform. So I think, yeah, I think what we are facing is we need a political reform, economic reform, education reform, as well as social reform, because still our choices, still our decisions is based on our mentality, our social career, about our social standard. Now in the Gulf, all of the Gulf are seeking to have a university degree and university certification. Why? Because this is a social standard and all of people need to be graduate from university. However, in the Gulf, in Kuwait, we don't need that much number of students. And maybe Dr. Hanaa, she did her work and her thesis about this idea and about the vocational training. Still, people in the Gulf are not willing to join the vocational training. Even we have several reform to the vocational training because it's part of the social standard and part of the social image of each one of us. So I think, yeah, we need a political reform, we need an education reform, and as more as important, and a social reform movement in order to accept the shift from one type of oil, from one type of revenues to other. Because this type of revenues, for example, the knowledge economic or all of these stuff, needs a critical thinker, a problem solver. You need an creativity. However, this type of competences, if we name it universal competences, if not allowed the people to practice it in their real life as well as at the work, there is no any need to educate the young generation on these competencies.
Yeah, excellent points. Thank you so much for raising them. Dr. Mark, being close, working closely with Vision 2030, do you see the vision sort of encapsulating political, economic, legal, sociocultural changes, or is it just, you're muted? Dr. Mark, you're muted?
Apologies.
Yes,
No, apologies. It's not just socioeconomic. And as Dr. Hanaa says, it encompasses all areas. And I think what's very interesting in the kingdom, of course, is we see massive promotion of the sociocultural side, the huge promotion and flourishing of the Saudi art scene, the Saudi cultural scene, the heritage. That might be at the top end, for example, the Diriyah Gate project happening in the west of Riyadh, which is based completely on Saudi heritage and is absolutely amazing. And when it opens, it's going to be world class. It's absolutely beautiful. But at the same time, it's not just the big government projects like that. For example, last weekend I went to an exhibition of Jizani art from Jizan City here in Riyadh. So we're seeing this also a diversity of these things happening as well. So it's a lot of areas. And I'd also like to point out, and I think very importantly, when we talk about sort of participation, when you talk about politics, when you talk about the type of government, is an incredibly important issue is Saudi Arabia's impressive response to COVID-19. And they had one lockdown, which ended in June 2020, a minor sort of closure for 4 weeks in February when cases went only above 300, and that was the time. But otherwise, Saudi Arabia has been operating more or less normally since June 2020, which you can't say that about a lot of other countries. So that has obviously raised a lot of questions amongst people when I chat to them about, systems of government, because there has been something to compare. Hang on, this has worked here, and it hasn't worked in places where we thought it would work. So, this has changed a lot of people's ideas about systems of government and about their own government as well, because obviously, that they see that actually the response here was extremely good, and that the society and communities across the kingdom were by and large protected and vaccinated, and it's been very, very impressive.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mark. We have an education-related question. What are some tangible and viable recommendations for education reform that you think would stoke private sector participation? Dr. Hanaa?
I'll go back to the recommendation I made earlier, which is related to career guidance. I mean, there isn't career guidance, especially at what we do is we look at job seekers who can't find jobs and offer career guidance to them instead of starting very early and looking at what young people within schools could actually have access to. So career guidance is actually not available to young Saudis within their schools at the moment. Nobody is given this opportunity to sit with a counselor that will tell them about the role of self-awareness in seeking jobs, the role of understanding the labor market, the role of talking to people about their roles to explore what you might want to do. So to me, it seems like a no-brainer to introduce it very early on and to have it done by professionals within education, within the, every single school. But that's not happening still. So I think that for me is a quick win. Obviously, you do need training because you don't have career guidance counselors that are equipped to work with young students at the moment, but it's not impossible to do. And you need more data that's available to these career guidance counselors. So I would say for me, it goes back to that really in the end, because then you understand how different employment opportunities are beneficial. So you understand that actually maybe a government role isn't what you want to do, and you can chart your pathway in a very different way if you have that information earlier on, if you're equipped with it and you're equipped with kind of tools to plan that. Maybe you don't want to go to an academic university for 4 years and you actually do want to go into vocational training, but what you think of when you think of vocational training isn't what's actually on offer. Maybe you have a lot of skills that you have no idea how to market. All of this would be addressed through more career guidance. So that is my recommendation.
There's a stigma around vocational training. At least I know from in Kuwait, it's kind of viewed as something that is kind of less than, and this is something that we also need to address when we talk about career guidance. Ibrahim, how would you, in terms of like educational reform, how would you approach this question, and especially in relation to the private sector, knowing very well that the private sector is still very young, if not still amateur, at least in respect to Kuwait for.
Yeah, first of all, I totally agree with Dr. Hanaa about what she said. But most important thing, I think, when it's come to the education reform and education system, I think we need more participation and involvement of private sector in the education system in Kuwait, for example. So when it's come to the education reform in Kuwait, the previous education reform, because nowadays officially Kuwait doesn't have any education reform, which that stopped in 2019. There was no any involvement. So I think there are lots of opportunity from the graduation student, as well as for the private sector, to hire Kuwaitis and young Kuwaitis. And we saw many good examples of Kuwaiti working in the private sectors. If we look at the bank industry in Kuwait, the majority of who's working in the bank and the banking system are Kuwaitis. This is a great examples of how we can target the youth to work in this market. So I think this is one of the most important thing, is the involvement and early involvement, as well as the private sector need to know exactly what they need from these graduation, as well as the education system, as the government, also at the government, need to know exactly what they are our target. Working and reforming the system without having a clear target doesn't work well.
Thank you so much. Dr. Mark, how would you approach this question? Again, I really liked what you said about the desire for skills. How can we sort of plant this at a very young age using education reform?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, not wanting to repeat what, obviously Dr. Hanaa just said, but, this sort of career guidance is extremely important. I think as well is that, there's a tendency to sort of think about sort of employment as jobs for young people, but we also have to be aware that actually a lot of these young people don't want jobs. They want a career, and that's different. And this also leads to, I think, another very important issue which is sometimes lacking, and that is mentoring. And mentoring is not just about sort of talking to university students or before school students. Mentoring goes beyond that into the workplace and beyond. And that's something that I talk to a lot of young people. I've taught thousands of young people over the years here, and what I've often noticed is that they want to be mentored, but they don't realize that they want to be mentored because they're not actually getting that. Now that I'm involved with a program here at the moment called the Salam Program for Cultural Communication, which is actually a mentoring program, and it is 120 young Saudi leaders, both genders, a 50-50 mix, which is a mentoring program in the evening, even though they are all in full-time employment. And it's absolutely wonderful, I think, because you can see that although they have a full-time job, maybe at a ministry or some high-ranking law company or something, there's still this sort of thirst for, how can I develop? How can I move forward? So I think mentoring is something that needs to be looked at more seriously, and again, needs to be factored into the education system so that students can transition from the education system into employment and also continue to be mentored and continue to develop as they move through their careers.
Yes, mentorship is really, really important and sometimes often overlooked. But I think it needs to be included in educational reform. We have two questions from Luke. Do you think the remnants of the Arab Spring happening nearby have affected the current generation of youth, being that the generation above them took part in a push for such regional change? That's the first question. And do you believe this affects the types of specializations they choose in university and jobs they choose? Maybe more specifically, how do you think the politics of the region affects the jobs they choose? So again, Dr. Hanaa.
Before I say that, can I just comment really quick on the mentorship and Ibrahim's comment on education, then I'll talk about this. I think in terms of the participation of the labor market in the education reforms is super important. But I also, I think in terms of participation in general, I do think that actually parents and students should be more involved in what's happening in the education system. And then that would also open up lots of doors for mentorship, which help young people understand the importance of vulnerability from an early age, because there is this idea that you finish your education and you're ready, but actually you're vulnerable throughout your life, and having a mentor, lifelong mentor, is actually something that really brings that home. So I just wanted to say that. But in terms of Luke's question, I mean, I don't know that I necessarily have an answer. I don't know if I know the answer to this. I think that the politics of the region probably affect choices for young people. In terms of university specializations, I would say the politics of the region in terms of the shift away from dependence on oil is more influential in terms of what people are choosing to specialize in. So there's less of this kind of traditional, like, let me go into petroleum engineering, for instance, if that's what you would have gone into, and more looking at, well, I have an opportunity to pursue arts and culture. I have an opportunity to pursue other types of business opportunities because of the diversification of the economy. So, I mean, that's kind of one way of looking at that. I do think that perhaps this is different in different GCC countries. And I think that one thing that a lot of these visions have done was really kind of highlight that there are differences that need to be addressed more head on. And that, when you have an opportunity to give everybody, all segments of society, an opportunity to pursue things, which is definitely happening on a larger scale within the Saudi context, for instance, when I'm talking about women and minorities, for instance, and also migrant workers, then you see kind of better labor market outcomes in general. So I think you're moving toward that. We're obviously not there, but I think that might be another kind of byproduct of the politics of the region.
Ibrahim, how would you approach this, the two questions raised? I mean, I think we maybe have felt it more in Kuwait than other GCC countries.
Yeah, I think so. But the part that I think, what Hanaa mentioned, is that it's depend on the political structure for each region that might have a variation between the youth choice to choose the career. For example, in Kuwait, we are a little bit more open in the politics life than other Gulf states, as we have a parliament and we have some informal parties in Kuwait. So we can observe that there are many students and many young generation who join the political science college or career in order aiming to be in the future are a parliament member or to work in any of political parties. So it's depend. We can't mention that the political structure can influence or change the structure of the students.
It's a very interesting perspective. Dr. Mark, how do you see the two questions?
Like Dr. Hanaa, I don't really think I see sort of in Saudi Arabia, that is a sort of direct impact. However, I think there are probably indirect ones. I do see, for example, what I see happening quite a lot is there's more of a sense amongst, a lot of young Saudis in terms of maybe jobs that they're thinking about, or maybe jobs that they think that they might like to do, and is linked very closely to sort of personal identities, or establishing, sort of more of a personal identity, a personal brand, if you like, and whether that's, related to their hobbies that they do, because you do see quite a lot of young people now who actually, they realize that they can maybe monetize a hobby, and this is sort of something we've seen behind this sort of the entrepreneurial trend happening. So but that's obviously something more indirect. I agree with what Dr. Hanaa is saying as well, is that those sort of the diversification of the economy, the sort of the opportunities, that different opportunities are becoming available, are starting to sort of change mindsets about this. A couple of weeks ago, I was actually having supper with a group of young students that I taught in 2013, and they were actually petroleum engineers, and they went to Aramco because that's what you did, but they've subsequently gone on to do something else. And they said then that when they talk to young students now who are just about to graduate, the way they think about sort of their futures is very different from how they thought about their futures in 2013, which is not actually that long ago. And one of them actually joked to me, and he said, yes, for us it was a case of graduate, join Aramco, retire, die. And that was sort of the phrase. It was a joke, but there's a lot of truth in that. So I think that there's this issue of personal identities, and I think there's also this issue that that they're thinking differently, and therefore there are more choices available as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mark. We are almost arriving at the end of this really interesting talk that we want to open up more and talk a lot more. I'm going to take one more question. There was one question that actually, Dr. Hanaa, you answered when you gave your side comment, which is about the role of parents and mentoring. So the final question, I think we should look at entrepreneurship. And there's the one question that asks, do you think government planning has addressed potential opportunities among youth entrepreneurs? And I think I will annex my own question to it, especially in light of the pandemic, of COVID pandemic. We saw some stimulus packages, and do you think the government played a good role in that? What do you think, Dr. Hanaa?
I think that one thing that the government really is stressing in Saudi specifically is kind of this independence from government. So there is definitely a movement in that direction, which means they're encouraging young people to really try and pursue their own careers, their own futures. And there is a lot of support for entrepreneurship and new business development. You have many entities that were set up specifically to help incubate new projects, but also to fund them. And you're seeing more and more. I mean, they're looking for the next unicorn, but they're funding a lot of small businesses. And so I think there's a huge kind of network of support that exists and is growing. And there's a lot of venture capital, and there's a lot of people coming into the region looking for that next big thing. Maybe the innovation isn't there yet, and that's where we need to focus. And, I have definitely written about this myself. So I think innovation is an area we're lacking. There's a lot of replication of the same types of projects. So, there's a little bit of risk taking because you have some sort of support network, but not loads. And so innovation is still stifled by that. However, there is support and there's a lot of funding in that area. So I think within Saudi specifically, because of the need to diversify and this acknowledgement that SMEs will drive growth in the future, this is an area that has definitely been given a lot of attention in the past couple of years.
Ibrahim, how do you see it in terms of the context of Kuwait and maybe other examples from the Gulf that you're familiar with?
Yeah,
The question of entrepreneurs.
yeah, I think in Kuwait we need more support from the government to support the entrepreneurs, as well as I agree with Hanaa about the repetition. We need more creativity, as well as the most important thing is the support from the government in Kuwait. COVID-19 shows that if you are an entrepreneur and you have your own small business, we are so sorry, you can face it alone. This is not good for the youth and not good for the economy as well, because we are pushing and we are repeating every time that we need you to work in the private sector. We need you to be independent. We need you to be to do your what you love and what you choose. However, when any crisis happens, such as COVID-19, I think if we did any research now in Kuwait, we will be shocked with the ideas and the results that people are not willing to take this risk.
Thank you. Dr. Mark, what can you add to what Dr. Hanaa said? You're muted again.
I think sometimes there's been, as Dr. Hanaa said, there's been huge promotion of this. It's been very much a sort of hot topic and very trendy and what have you. I think, though, from the perspective of a lot of young people at times, they have a too rosy picture of what this is going to be like. You can get some money, start your own company, and wow, rather than actually sort of being given the hard facts about the numbers of startups that actually fail. And also then, of course, this leads into that sort of socio-cultural issue as well of failure, and the fact that the likelihood is you're going to fail, and you're going to have to fail quickly and learn from that and sort of pick yourself up and start again. So I don't think that is adequately explained a lot of the time, and I think it needs to be.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the speakers today. I really enjoyed speaking and thinking alongside every important point that you've raised. Thank you to all our participants and our audience who joined us tonight or this afternoon. The question of youth remains a very important question, and it will remain over the coming, probably decade ahead. We have a lot of challenges ahead of us. We need to move at rapid speed, and we definitely need a lot of publications and involvement from scholars also, and to bridge the gap between the private sector, to kind of grow the private sector, whether it's through FDI and then involve nationals within that FDI, companies and other opportunities. We've heard of slimming down of government entities. We're seeing that in neighboring countries. So we look forward to a positive future. We hope, and we look forward for more youth engagement. Perhaps encourage them. I always tell students, to write, because writing is really important to put their thoughts into words, and that's something that I always encourage my students to do. So thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. I had a pleasure speaking with you, and thank you to Gulf International Forum for hosting this event.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.